Hello and welcome to yet another History of Video podcast for the course on Making a Modern Britain 1951 to 2007. This time we're going to have a look at the economy 1951 to 64. First up, let's have a look at the prosperity / affluence of the period. It's been called the Golden Age or a new Elizabethan age because Elizabeth had just become queen, and it involved consumer goods, holidays, clothes, TVs, cars, washing machines, refrigerators, furniture, all bought on hire purchase or HB, and loans repaid over several years. The advertising industry took off, especially with the new ITV TV channel. There's an increase in savings, with wages rising from £8.30 to £15.35 between the period 51 to 61, and real wages went up as well. People could actually buy more rather than just being inflation. New towns expanded. These new towns had been created by Labour, however. 1.7 million homes were built by 1964 by the Conservatives. Farmers were helped by government subsidies. Rationing ended in 1954 after being worse than actually during the war under Labour and its austerity measures. Unemployment averaged at 2%. Compare this to the 1930s when it was at 13%. This was great. And when it reached 500,000 in the 50s, it was seen as a disaster, which it really wasn't. It was also easier to switch jobs in this period. Some businesses were doing really well. The rate of growth of GDP was bigger than between 1906 and 1939, a third higher than the interwar period. The Marshall Plan caused an uplift in the economy in the early 50s. Companies like Royal Dutch, Shell, Unilever, and various steel firms like Concert, including ICI as well and Rolls-Royce, all were doing really well. Brad Butler had a lot to do with this. He continued to maintain full employment, whilst maintaining growth as well. He expanded the welfare state. He committed to heavy defence spending and nuclear weapons. He acknowledged the deflationary policies in the late 1940s had short-term benefits, i.e. cheap goods to export. However, we were still in debt and still kept spending, which is part of Butskelism and the post-war consensus. Although Butler did prefer interest rates rather than government intervention and taxation as a way of keeping inflation down, contrary to what Gateskill believed, which was government intervention and taxation. In 1952, Butler proposed cutting the pound free from the Bretton Woods exchange policy and floating it, which had been closer to monetarism, or at least the free market anyway. This is called robot, and Churchill rejected it, and even Eden scuppered it as Foreign Secretary. Let's have a look at stop-go economics. This is the tension between an expanding economy with low interest rates and then rising consumer spending, i.e. the dash for growth, the go bit of it, and on the other side it's overheating of the economy where wages and imports rise above productivity and exports. And this is the stop bit of the economy where you have to have interest rates that are increased and then increasing taxes as well, and even increasing import controls to stop imports coming into the country. All this led to budget politics causing high inflation in 1959 and 1964, and the balance of payments going up to £800 million deficit because British industry couldn't produce enough consumer goods, so they had to be imported if people wanted them. Lacking in economic strategy, some people have said. It wasn't an integrated plan, it wasn't consistent, and therefore industry couldn't plan properly. And the policy possibly lagged behind events and it didn't shape them. It was reacting rather than dictating. And this is the main thrust of what people argue when they say it was 13 wasted years, that Conservatives just bumbled from one thing to another, only trying to get themselves through the next election. You can see this in the giveaway budgets in 1955 and 1959. When Butler was Chancellor in 55, he gave the middle classes £134 million in tax cuts. That was in the 55 budget. In 1959 budget, before the 1959 election, there are £370 million in tax cuts by Heathcote Amory, at a time where, Lynch says anyway, prevailing high inflation might have made financial restraint a better option, but then again this would not win votes. Let's have a look at the 1957 financial crisis. Suez had swollen our debts by £564 million. Inflation was running high, wage rises were above productivity, and there'd been a run on the pound in 1957. The pound might have had to be devalued against the dollar. And Peter Thornycroft wanted to cut wage increases and reduce the money supply, which again is similar to the 1980s idea of monetarism. MacLeod argued for Keynesianism, which goes back to consensus, what they've been going through for the previous 15 years or so. So unemployment wouldn't happen and the houses could still be built. This caused divisions in the cabinet, and Macmillan, who was Prime Minister at the time, chose to carry on spending, so Thornycroft resigned along with Nigel Birch and Enoch Powell. Macmillan papered this over and called it a little local difficulty, and sterling did actually recover against the dollar. So Macmillan and the economy. He didn't try and do anything about sluggish growth and continued Butler's Keynesianist policies. He introduced the Rent Act to abolish rent controls and put 6 million houses on the market. Borrowing was encouraged to create a property-owning democracy, but critics have said this was too reliant on dangerous heavy borrowing, which encouraged irresponsibility and materialism. Macmillan claimed this affluence as a conservative policy. Whether it was or not depends on your point of view. Or you could just say it was the conditions of the world, but Macmillan claimed it as conservative policy, and it gave them some credit. Unemployment was rising under Macmillan. It was almost 1 million by 1963, well, 800,000, and all the weapons used by Labour in the 1960s to control the economy were already in place under Macmillan, so they did very few new things in the 60s that the Conservatives hadn't tried in the 50s. Okay, the 1961 financial crisis. There were worries about an overheating economy, and that forced a pay pause to hold down wage inflation. The NEDC, National Economic Development Council, or NEDI, was introduced to encourage cooperation between government, employers and the unions. But this ended up causing this economic financial crisis, causing the Night of the Long Knives. The 1961 application to the EEC was supposed to boost industrial production for a large-scale market, i.e. Europe, and it was supposed to give industrial productivity a bit of a boost by the increased competition of Europe, and it was supposed to stimulate growth by encouraging EEC expansion. Overall, though, Britain suffered relative decline. Britain's share of the world trade in 1951 was a quarter, while in 1975 it was a tenth. Government failed to control public spending. They failed to front up to union wage demands. Churchill was as much to blame as anybody for this. Industry had failed to restructure, to modernise, and even to invest in itself. The education of technical people was neglected. The technical schools set up in the 1944 Education Act were not a big success. Nationalisation was a mistake. Possibly. Too much help for lame ducks? Possibly. Too many government regulations and high taxes were not helping. Trade unions were causing inefficiency or laziness. Maybe even you could link that to the welfare state. There was a lack of the entrepreneurial classes in this country. The establishment were not encouraged to be businessmen. There's too much concentration on full employment, and that was bound to lead to inflation. And there's a decline of traditional manufacturing industries. And Britain were not good in the new ones, the electrical industry, for example. Germany and Japan have been restricted on a military front, but Britain wasn't, and it was even obliged by martial aid to help to come to the Americans' aid in stopping communism, Korean War, for example. Germany and Japan had to modernise because of the damage they suffered in World War II, and we didn't have that structural damage, so we weren't. What the British did in the 1950s was try and set up or continue the sterling area, which is trying to make the Empire, or Commonwealth, whatever you want to call it, this point pay, but it didn't really work. So let's have a look at some historical interpretation. Macmillan, this is his speech. Let's be frank about it. Most of our people have never had it so good. What is beginning to worry some of us is it too good to be true? Our concern today is, can prices be steadied while at the same time remain full employment in an expanding economy? If inflation prices out of world markets, we'll be back in the old nightmare of unemployment, and he said that in July 1957. He also said, 10 years ago, most of them would not have had cars and would have seen the seaside, if at all, once a year. Thornycroft said, we have slithered from one crisis to another in 1958. Derek Murphy says, the turnaround of the economy was not down to Butler, but international economic conditions. Corelli Barnett says the crises of the 1970s were inevitable consequences of a long-term decline. He argues we were still relying economically on a Victorian structure. Crusoe says, without 7% of the GDP taken from military spending, Germany and Japan's rise against Britain doesn't look quite as impressive. Larry Elliott and Dan Atkinson argue that 1951 to 73 was the golden age. Hennessy also says the golden age marked a generation of progress. Alford says Britain's poor economic performance has been the dominant theme in political debate and the economic discourse since the 1950s. Glynn and Booth argue that no single answer can fully explain the time and pattern of the British slide. Sidney Pollard argues that the cycle helped to encourage, this is a stop-go cycle, it helped to encourage imports at the cost of exports and created a downward spiral. Michael Surrey supports policy stop-go and points out that the cycle actually provided a stable policy framework which was committed to full employment and a stable exchange rate and economic growth. Derek Murphy, again, says the impact of the policies may be exaggerated as policies had relatively little impact on growth. The housing drive, he also says, was a big source of popularity for the Conservatives. Hennessy says Roebuck was a desperate response of a frazzled and clever man who had run out of caution and alternative ideas.